Chapter 1. Percy, Earl of Stenwick, rolled his shoulders as he looked up from his desk. He'd been working on the design for a new fountain for 6 hours straight, and his body was starting to give out. He wasn't used to working hunched over a desk for so long, because he spent most of his time actually building his designs. This one needed to be perfect, though. He wasn't certain why, but he could feel it. His mother had asked to meet with him at his convenience that day, before the guests started to arrive for her country house party. He'd asked her repeatedly not to do something as ridiculous as throw a party, but she hadn't listened. Of course, she'd never listened to his father, either. He stayed in the country because he liked his privacy. Knowing that, why would she drag people out to the country manor house? He didn't want anyone there. Thinking of his father made Percy frown. When he'd inherited the title from his father, he'd been convinced that everything in life would magically become easier. Instead, he'd found himself saddled with a mother, 2 younger sisters, and estates that were mortgaged almost to the point of ruination. Everything that wasn't entailed had been sold off, so he was left to come home early from Oxford to try to find a way to keep the family afloat. Percy had found it in his trade. He smiled as he thought the word. His mother would be scandalized if she knew he'd ever even thought it, but he didn't care. He'd sent his mother and sisters off to live at the townhouse in London with all but 3 of the servants. Those 3 remained behind with him and put up with his eccentric ways, which included being something of a craftsman. Growing up, he'd never had any idea he'd one day be a tradesman or a craftsman, but he didn't resent the direction his life had taken. He loved his work and felt alive through it. One of his servants was his man about town, Bertram. Bertram sold his creations to those willing to pay the price he asked, and even took on commissions. Bertram had learned to evade and not tell anyone who he worked for, simply calling him Mr. P to anyone who asked. Percy didn't care what he was called to anyone else. As long as the money came in to slowly pay off his family's debts and keep his mother and sisters going to parties during the season, he was satisfied. There was a short knock on his door, and his mother breezed in without waiting for a response. "Percy, I told you I needed to speak with you today." She had a cross look on her face, but Percy ignored it. She almost always looked cross when she spoke with him. His mother was only in her early 50s, but to Percy's eye, she looked much older. She'd let herself go to pot after his father had died. "Yes, Mother. I've been working. What can I help you with?" He tore his eyes away from the design and gave her his full attention. "Working? You mean working on the estate accounts?" Her voice was filled with disapproval. She didn't like how long he wore his dark hair. She didn't like the fact that he worked for a living. "You know it's not, but you've told me never to tell you what it is that I do. Do you want to know now?" Percy smiled at her sweetly, knowing it would simply annoy her. He was a good son and did his duty by his family, but he wasn't about to be pushed around and bullied. Horatia wanted to know nothing of the sort, and he knew it. She was scandalized that he'd had to actually work after his father's death, but she certainly wasn't scandalized enough to stop her ridiculous spending. "You know I don't. Don't get sassy with me, Percy." Percy leaned back in his chair and looked at his mother. At 32, he didn't think he was being sassy, but he wasn't going to argue with her. "Is there something you wanted to talk to me about?" Horatia took the seat across from Percy's desk and carefully arranged her skirts. "Our guests will be arriving any moment." "Your guests will arrive at any moment. I am hiding myself away doing my work like I always do." Percy looked back down at the drawing he'd made of the fountain. Something wasn't quite right yet. I know something else is supposed to be there, but what?" "Fine, Percy. My guests will be arriving at any moment. There's something I need to tell you about them, though." Percy's eyes narrowed at the sound of his mother's voice. She was hiding something from him. "What?" He continued to contemplate the fountain as he listened to her. Have you heard of Alexander Smith? He's a tradesman, but his daughter, Diana, has been accepted into our fold. He knew her use of the word "our" encompassed all of society in London. Percy raised an eyebrow. He knew of Alexander, but only because the man had purchased one of his statues and paid a small fortune for the thing. Of course, Alexander had no idea he was the craftsman, and it was probably better all around if he never knew. I know of him. Well, his daughter is a true beauty, and she comes with a large dowry. The largest being offered in London at this time. We all know because the man was rude enough to brag about it. Her blue eyes met his brown. Do you understand what I'm saying? Percy shrugged. She's an heiress. Wonderful. Horatio sighed. She's a beautiful heiress that men seem to run from, for some absurd reason. Anyway, her father is worried that she's firmly on the shelf, which she may be, because she's 23 without a single prospect. Her father made the mistake of telling her, before her first season, that she had the right to say no to any man he suggested for her. She shook her head at the idea of a woman being allowed to reject her suitor. Why are you telling me all this? Horatio sat up in her chair and smiled at him. It was a smile that had once been all the rage in London, but now he felt it was rather sad-looking. Because Alexander, and I think she would be a wonderful match for you. Percy immediately shook his head. I'm slowly getting us out of debt, Mother. You don't want for anything. I don't need an heiress to get us out of the predicament Father left us in. Don't speak ill of your father, Horatio said sharply. Percy sighed. He knew that she spoke ill of his father whenever he and his sisters weren't around to hear it, so he wasn't sure why it was a problem that he did. I'm not marrying the girl. Send her away. He looked back down at the drawing, effectively dismissing her. I'll do no such thing. You will come to dinner tonight, and escort her to the table. You will be kind, witty, and charming, all of which I'm well aware you are capable of. There will be no more of this trade nonsense. You'll marry a nice little heiress and take your place in society where you belong. Percy stood, shoving back from the desk. I will not. I have no interest in marrying anyone right now. I want to get us totally out of debt first. Surely you can see that it's not a good idea for me to marry anyone at this time. He could make ends meet, of course, and a wife wasn't totally out of the question, but a wife his mother chose? That was out of the question. Surely you can see that I ask very little of you. I let you sit out here in the country rusticating instead of doing your duty to your title. You will at least meet this girl and be kind to her. She's coming here expecting that you will be a match. Don't disappoint me. Horatio turned and stormed out of the room, shutting the door harder than she would have otherwise, but not hard enough for Percy to call it a slam. No, his perfect lady mother would never slam a door. He turned to the window and looked out over his land. The land owned by his father and his father's father before him. Land that had been bequeathed to his family by a king hundreds of years ago for some reason now unknown. He shook his head. He had no desire to marry and act like he was better than others. He was happy with his trade. Of all the young men he'd known at university, he felt like he was the only one who was actually doing something with his life. Yes, he'd been raised to believe the nobility didn't work, but his attitude had changed. He wouldn't give up his work for anything. He walked back over and looked down at his drawing of the fountain. Something was still missing, and he needed to figure out what before he began building it. Asterisk. Diana sat beside her mother on the seat of the family's coach. She peered out the window and up at the beautiful old house. Inside there, somewhere, was the man her father wanted her to marry. She didn't know why she felt excited this time. None of the men he wanted her to marry ever worked for her. They were too judgmental. They were too stern. They were too noble. This time though? Her excitement knew no bounds. Was he looking out the window hoping for a first glimpse of her? She patted her hair to make sure it looked right. Diana, stop fidgeting. Her mother scolded. Jane Smith had been raised in London, the daughter of a shopkeeper. She had carefully learned to sound like the upper class. She worked hard to emulate everything the nobility did. The thought of her daughter marrying an earl gave her heart palpitations. Of the good sort, of course. Who wouldn't want their only child to marry a nobleman? I'm sorry, Mama. Diana sighed. She hated trying to always be perfect. She missed the days when she could play in the streets of London with the other children. When her father had struck it rich with the sugar plantations he'd invested in, she had thought her life would change for the better. Her life had changed all right. It had changed into a boring, perfect life. She felt as if she were always being examined and found lacking. She longed for the freedom to be who she wanted to be and not have to worry about messing up her silk dress. After 5 London seasons, she was still unmarried. Her father had paid a great deal of money for her to be able to go to all the best parties, but it didn't seem to matter. She kept using her abilities and upsetting people. How could she not, though? Diana looked up at the house again. She was used to the big houses of the aristocracy. She always felt as if they were somehow rejecting her, though. This one? This one seemed to be welcoming her. She could picture the house with all the doors and windows flung wide, as if asking her to step inside and join it. When the carriage stopped, she forced herself to sit quietly and wait for the coachman to open the door for her. She looked across at her father, who had his work spread out around him. He always said, "I can't waste the time I'm in a carriage doing nothing. I must be productive." He would stare down at his documents for about 5 minutes, and then he would fall into a loud snoring sleep. Diana had once thought it was funny, and teased her father about it, but her mother had shushed her, just as she always did. For some reason, her mother thought that a young lady shouldn't laugh in public. Diana was the first to step down from the carriage, and she looked around her in awe. All of the flowers and trees were blooming. It was a beautiful place to be, and she couldn't wait to spend the next 3 days there. She was glad she'd been invited to meet the Earl at a house party, because she wasn't certain she could have been polite enough in public. She just wasn't good at balls. She preferred small intimate gatherings like this one was supposed to be. A man in a butler's uniform greeted Diana with a smile. "Welcome, miss?" Diana smiled, wishing she didn't always have to be so formal. "Smith. Diana Smith. It's nice to meet you, Miss Smith. You and your parents have been placed in the West Wing with the family. I hope that meets with your approval." He nodded to one of the maids who hovered nearby. "Please take Miss Smith and her parents up to the West Wing. 2 rooms have been readied for them." The maid nodded once and led the way up the stairs. Diana glanced over her shoulder to make certain her parents had caught up before following. "This house is beautiful. Do you know when it was built?" she asked. She had always been fascinated by the older houses of the nobility. Whenever she was invited to someone's country home, she took as much time as she could and just explored admiring the architecture. The maid gave her a startled look, obviously not used to being asked questions by the guests. Diana didn't care, though. She knew none of the other guests would speak with her freely. It was always good to make friends with one of the servants in a case like this. "I don't know, Mississippi." Diana nodded. "Not even an inkling of century?" "I'm enthralled by old buildings." The maid shook her head and hurried on. Diana sighed. There went that potential friendship. There'd be another, she was sure. And there was also Anna, her own maid. She wouldn't learn much about the family or the house's architecture, but she wouldn't be completely alone. Diana looked around the room she was taken to. "This will be your room, Mississippi." Your parents' room is right through here. She showed Diana the connecting hall that could only be reached from the two rooms in question. As the maid left to help the next guests, Diana went to the window to look out. Maybe there would be a gardener outside she could become acquainted with. She wasn't picky. She'd be friends with anyone who wasn't afraid of her. There was a man with dark hair. She could make friends with him. Diana rushed down the stairs while her parents were occupied, knowing her mother would be mortified if she left. Jane expected Diana to sit in her lonely room and do needlepoint when there were no activities at a house party, while Diana would prefer to wander around and explore the grounds. She went to the back gardens and smiled as she saw the man she'd seen from the window, dressed in obvious gardening clothes, digging through a pile of stones. "Hello," she called. Percy turned to see who was disturbing him. Had the guests really started arriving already? He'd hoped there would be a sudden rainstorm, and they would all be stuck in the mud. The last thing he needed was a bunch of marriage-minded young women and their mamas crawling all over his estate. "May I help you?" Diana smiled and walked over to him, looking down at the stones he was sorting. "Not really. I'm here for a party, and just wanted to talk to someone. Do you have any idea how old this home is?" "It's beautiful." She looked at the house and made it clear she was truly interested in the house and not something else. Percy looked at her for a moment. He had no idea who she was, but with her blonde good looks and her fiery green eyes, he was surprised she was wanting for company. It was built in 1647. He turned back to his stones, not wanting to look at her any longer. There was something compelling about her that made him want to spend the entire day staring at her beauty. That wouldn't do, of course, because he had work to do. He didn't want to feel obliged to entertain any of the young ladies at the house party, either. "I've never seen anything like it," she said honestly. "The stone structure is truly amazing." She walked to the wall and ran her hand over the perfectly matched stones. "I don't think any stones were cut. They were placed together in whatever size they came in." Percy smiled for a moment, taken by the girl. She was interested in his craft, apparently. "I prefer that type of stonework myself. When someone resorts to cutting rocks and making them all the same, there's really no point in looking at it. The details of that wall fascinate me." He only wished he could take credit for designing it, but he knew that one of his ancestors had done that job. She turned back to him with a smile. "It's nice to meet a fellow lover of the arts. My father bought a bench for our back garden that was created by a stonemason who did this kind of work. I was afraid to sit on it at first, because it was so beautiful." Percy grinned. "But you sit on it now?" He knew the bench she was talking about, because he'd made it himself. She laughed. "It's my favorite place in our back garden. I go out there with a good book, and sit and read it all day long." She wished she could have stayed there this weekend instead of coming to this house party, but her father was determined to see her married before the season was over. Her mother had complained to him that she was getting long in the tooth, and if she didn't marry soon she never would. It must be nice to have the kind of time on your hands where you can sit and read all day. Truly, he didn't enjoy being idle, but he did miss having the kind of free time he'd had before taking on the responsibilities that came with being an earl and keeping his family afloat. She shrugged. "Honestly, I sometimes wish my mother would let me work, but it's inappropriate." She sighed. "The life of the idle rich is not for me. I come from a long line of hard workers." She crossed her arms over her chest, and her eyes dared him to argue with her. Percy eyed her for a moment, thinking about who she must be. "You're not Diana Smith?" Was it possible that his mother had picked out a woman for him who actually agreed with his philosophy on life? Diana's eyes widened with surprise. "I am." "Who are you?" Percy sighed. If he admitted to her who he was, Would she automatically start flirting with him, or would he be able to keep up the easy friendship they'd begun with their mutual love of stonework? Maybe telling her would let him know whether or not she was worth pursuing. "I'm Percy, Earl of Stenwick." Diana looked him up and down in his work clothes. "You are?" Could he really be the Earl her father so badly wanted her to marry? When had her father discovered good taste? Percy grinned. "What, I don't look like an earl to you?" She shook her head. "Not at all. You look more like a stonemason or a gardener." He frowned. He looked like a stonemason? Well, he was a stonemason, but he couldn't be both a stonemason and an earl this weekend. "I like to dabble with the stone arts. My mother would be mortified if anyone knew, though, so you mustn't say anything." Diana smiled. "If you don't tell my mother I sneaked out of my room while I was supposed to be napping, I won't tell your mother that you were wearing work clothes in the back garden when I sneaked out. That sounds like a fair deal." He held out his hand, which was covered with dirt, to shake hers, before dropping it and wiping his hand on his pants. "I'm sorry. I'm filthy." "Well, that's what happens with you dabble in the stone arts." Diana flashed him another smile, her green eyes dancing with laughter. "I'd better get back upstairs, before my mother realizes I'm missing." She turned and ran back toward the house, stopping for a moment to look over her shoulder and see if he was watching her. As soon as she got back to her room, Diana sighed. Yes, he was the man for her. Just like she knew when a couple wouldn't be good together, she knew that he would be perfect for her. She knew how to force him to fall in love with her, of course, but she didn't want that. She wanted it to come naturally. She was a woman filled with the power of love, but for once in her life, she wanted something to happen in the normal way. She'd had more than enough love-struck suitors at her feet. She wanted a man who could keep his feet and love her anyway. Chapter 2. Percy watched as the nymph who had called herself Diana ran back toward his house. This was the girl his mother wanted her to marry? When had his mother ever shown good taste? He wiped his hands with the rag hanging from his back trouser pocket and hurried back to the house. He needed to change for dinner, because it seemed that he would be escorting Diana to dinner. He grinned. His mother would find ways for them to be together, hoping that he would fall for the pretty heiress. Perfect. It should be easy to get to know her better. What else could a man ask for? Asterisk. When Diana stepped into the salon before dinner, her eyes immediately scanned the crowd for Percy. She couldn't believe the man her father wanted her to marry was actually amenable to her. He had shown abysmal taste in potential husbands for her up to this point, and she had a hard time believing he was doing so much better. There had to be something she was missing. She was flanked on both sides by her parents, her father's eyes obviously scanning the room trying to figure out who their host was, while her mother looked around for social connections. Diana cared about speaking to no one but the man she'd met in the garden. Diana saw him standing across the room with an older matron, the Dowager Countess, she believed. She had only met the woman once and had not been impressed. She knew she needed to act as if she had never met him, but he looked up from his conversation and gave her a wink, making her look down and cover her mouth delicately to stifle the giggle that wanted to escape. Her mother would not be pleased if she was giggling at a party. She followed her mother and took a seat on a sofa at the edge of the room. It was a small party with only her parents, his mother and sisters, and 3 other gentlemen she didn't know, all obviously there just to keep the numbers even. Diana found all of the small details society matrons worried about to be boring and tedious, so she truly didn't care whether or not the numbers were even. She was certain someday she would need to care, but she hoped it was a long time in the future. After a few moments of talking softly with her mother, one of her least favorite pastimes, she saw him approaching out of the corner of her eye. She said nothing as she waited for the introduction that would make it perfectly acceptable for her to carry on a conversation with him. She watched as he walked toward her, her heart starting to beat heavily. He was walking straight toward her. His mother stepped up behind him, and said in a soft voice that was perfectly modulated in every way, "Percy, I would like to present to you, Miss Diana Smith and her mother, Mrs. Jane Smith. Diana and Jane, this is my son, Percy, the Earl of Stenwick." Jane nodded briefly, but Diana got to her feet and offered her hand. Percy brought it to his lips. She noticed as he did that his fingers were raw-looking, but very clean. "It's nice to meet you, my lord. I'm so pleased to see you have clean hands. Why, just the other day a man tried to shake my hand and his was covered in dirt. It made me want to hide my hands from every gentleman from that moment on." She kept her voice soft so the others wouldn't hear. Her mother would be mortified if she thought she'd begun a conversation with a gentleman she'd just met that way. Percy grinned as he looked into her green eyes. "I suppose I could keep your right hand here." He tucked her hand through his arm. "That way if any new gentlemen want to shake it, they'll have to steal it from me." Diana smiled up at him. "So, I rarely see you around town. Why don't you come to the parties during the season?" If he had, she'd have met him that much sooner. She felt as if she had been wandering around her entire life, incomplete. Now, she was ready to be part of a set in a way she never had been. "I don't much like the season. I find the constant round of parties a bore." "Of course, if I'd known you would be at those parties," he whispered the words directly into her ear, so his mother wouldn't hear what he had to say. "I'm told that I'm supposed to escort you into dinner tonight." "I'd like that." Diana's father had presented her to a constant round of men for the past several years, trying to find her a man to marry. Her mother was desperate to be more accepted by society, and if Diana married a titled gentleman, that would make all the difference. Of course, Diana had never met a titled gentleman she liked to be in the same room with, let alone wanted to spend the rest of her life with, so she'd rejected one after the other. "It's nice to have an escort that won't bore me to death with his hunting adventures." As soon as the words popped out of her mouth, she bit her tongue. What if he enjoyed hunting? Percy choked on a laugh, obviously not offended by her words. "I will do my very best. I could bore you to death by telling you about my adventures, finding just the perfect glove if you'd like." The impish sparkle in her eyes told him that she was joking. "Oh, please do." "Well, let me start by saying that my mother bought me a ball gown in just the perfect shade of pink. It wasn't white, but so pale it was almost white. You know the color I mean, of course." He held up a hand. "You caught me. Please don't continue." Her laugh of utter joy rang out across the room and Alexander turned his head to stare at her. He looked at his wife. "Did you hear that? Did she really laugh?" Jane had tears in her eyes as she looked up into Alexander's eyes. "She did. I think we've finally found the man she will spend her life with." Jane closed her eyes as if in prayer. Diana finally marrying a member of the elite of society was what she needed to make her life complete. She could even overlook her over-exuberant laugh. Across the room, Diana smiled up at Percy. "So tell me about your home. I find older houses fascinating. The stonework and the architecture in particular." She leaned forward to whisper softly, "Is it haunted?" He chuckled. "I thought so when I was a boy, and I used to try to make noises to make my sisters think so as well." "Did it ever work?" Diana knew his sisters, and they were both sweet, but the younger seemed to be afraid of her own shadow. "Your sisters are Charlotte and Lucy, right?" "Yes." He rolled his eyes. "Charlotte is 22 and Lucy is 20. I think they're just now old enough have seasons, but of course, they've been in London for years." Diana smiled, secretly agreeing with him. She'd saved Charlotte from a bad marriage and the girl didn't even realize it. "Charlotte's not terribly fond of me." That was putting it very mildly. She wondered if it would bother him once he realized just how much other members of the ton disliked her. He looked at her with surprise. "I can't see anyone not liking you." She laughed softly, shocked he hadn't heard any of the rumors about her. "You'd be surprised." The butler she'd met earlier that day came to call them into dinner then, and she was relieved they wouldn't have to continue the conversation. She held his arm tightly as they walked into the dining room with the long table. As the host, Percy sat at the head of the table, but his mother had kindly placed Diana to his right. As soon as they were seated, she smiled at him. "What's for dinner?" she asked in a whisper. He shrugged. "I have no idea. My mother forced me to attend this party. I wanted to spend the weekend occupied in a different way." "With your stoneworking?" she asked with a smile. He nodded. "No one is supposed to know I do it, though. My mother would have the vapors." "But you're an artist. You obviously know your craft. How could anyone complain about a man pursuing his talents?" One of the things she hated most about the upper class was their utter derision of a man making money. "You haven't seen anything I've done," he said, knowing it was a lie. She had sat on one of his benches for hours reading books. He liked to think of her there, enjoying his creation. "Well, no, but I saw how you were with the stones, studying each one. I can't wait to see something you've completed." She smiled at him, letting him know that whatever he did was fine with her. There were, of course, other people around them throughout the meal, but she noticed none of them. Through every course, she talked to him and no one else. After dinner, the women went to a parlor to wait while the men had brandy and cigars. It was a ritual that Diana found old-fashioned and ridiculous, but she said nothing. With only 3 young ladies there was no entertainment for the evening, but they would have some dancing later. She couldn't wait. Surely Percy would ask her to dance, and they would float around the room in each other's arms. How had she spent her entire life waiting for such a special man, and only just now met him? When the men returned to them, Percy gave her an odd look as he offered her his arm. He escorted her out onto the balcony for a breath of fresh air, and asked her in low tones, "What power do you have over men?" He gave her a look that told her someone had been telling tales. Diana's eyes widened. She didn't know how to answer that question. She knew the answer, to some extent, but the ability to put it into words wasn't something that she was equipped with. "I'm not sure how to answer that question," she answered him honestly. "I heard no less than 5 stories in the past 30 minutes about how a young man will be on the verge of proposing to his young lady. He'll see you at a ball, and all of his focus will be on you. He'll be able to think of nothing but you until the following day, when his lady will invariably throw him over for the way he was with you the previous evening. You have no explanation for this?" He stood and watched her carefully, waiting for her response. She sighed. "I was born with, I don't know how to put it into words. I've never actually spoken of it with anyone." And she didn't want to explain it now. She wanted to get to know him slowly, without her powers coming into question so soon in their relationship. "I need to know what is wrong with you." His voice was low but adamant. It was clear he wasn't going to give up until he knew everything. She shook her head vehemently. "Nothing is wrong with me. I just have the ability to see whether or not couples should be together. When 2 people are at a ball together, I will see an aura, if you will. It's a color above their heads that tells me if they should be together or not." She wished she had better words for what she experienced, but she'd never told anyone before, even Anna. He gave a half laugh. "And what color means they shouldn't be together?" She sighed, knowing he wouldn't believe her. "Red. Red means danger in auras." She waited for him to tell her she was insane. She knew if the situation were reversed, she would probably tell him he was insane. "And a good color would be?" "You don't believe me, so why are you asking?" Diana took her arm from his and started back into the ballroom. She knew then it couldn't work between them, not if he couldn't believe her. She wished they could have gotten to know one another better before the topic came up, but she was certain it was happening this way for a reason. He caught her arm and stopped her. What color is a good color? Purple. There's everything in between, but red is bad and purple is good. Why don't you go laugh at me now? She'd never actually put into words before what she saw when she was around people. And for you and a potential husband? Do you see colors? Percy looked as if he were actually interested in what she was saying, although he was obviously skeptical. She shook her head. No, not unless I stand with a man in front of a mirror. She'd never met a man she'd cared to look into a mirror with. She'd always known instantly when a man was wrong for her. And you've done that? She shrugged. A few times as we danced, I would catch a glimpse. Has it ever been purple? Diana sighed. Never. I've wanted it to be, and tried to convince myself it was once or twice, but always I'd find out he was after my father's money. She shrugged. Did it really matter? He was done with her as well. Percy stared at the young woman in front of him. He could tell that she believed what she was saying. One of my sister, Charlotte's, beaux fell in love with you for one evening only. How did that happen? Diana shuddered, afraid to admit to the other half of what she could do. When I see a couple together that I know will not work out, I make him fall in love with me. I'm not sure how I can explain it better than that. I send out this feeling toward a man, and he will suddenly do anything for me. Anything. She shrugged. The feeling only lasts until I'm out of his sight, and then he's back to normal, but it's always enough for the women to realize they aren't meant to be with the man. He studied her for a moment. Do you know Anthony and Gabriella Lancaster? She nodded. Everyone knows them. They're the sweethearts of London. She said nothing else, wondering why he was asking. The Duke and Duchess of Avondale was adored by everyone, and known to be more in love than a couple had been in decades. You could see the love in their eyes when they entered a room, and they always danced at least 2 dances together. I went to school with Anthony. Tell me, what color do you see above them when they're together? Diana closed her eyes, not wanting to answer the question. Why would he believe her? Everyone believed they were the love match of the century. Finally she took a deep breath and looked into his eyes. Blood red. Percy's face was one of shock, and he turned from her. He alone knew that Anthony hated his wife. He'd married her for her riches, and nothing more. His father had forced the issue, and Anthony had done his duty by his family, but had always insisted on playing the part of a man in love. What about your parents? Diana smiled slightly. They're a blue. Not a true purple, but close to it. Father worships mother, and mother wants him to be happy, but she doesn't feel the kind of love for him that he does for her. She shrugged. They're happy together, though. Percy had surmised as much, not through any mystical power, but by the way the couple treated one another. He looked down at Diana for another moment. I'm going to take you to a mirror in my hallway. I want to know what color you see. Diana shook her head. I don't want to make any decisions based on this power. Please. She hated the idea of looking into the mirror and seeing red. He put her hand through his arm and carefully walked down the hall with her, stopping in front of a long mirror. Well? Are we red? Or purple? Diana stared at their reflection in the mirror, realizing she'd never seen such a true purple. He was the one and only love of her life. She decided then and there that if it didn't work out with Percy, she would find a way to remain a spinster. Never would she be happy with not having love when she knew where she could find it. She pulled away from him and ran toward the balcony, hoping he wouldn't follow. She didn't want to admit to the perfect purple they made together. How could she? Would he think he should propose if she did? She only wanted to marry a man who wanted her for herself. Not because some mystical power said they should be together. Not because she was an heiress. Because he loved her, Diana Smith. He followed her out, wondering what she could have seen to upset her so much. He'd still not been convinced she was telling the truth until he saw her face turn stark white when she'd looked into the mirror. He walked up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, rubbing them gently. "What did you see?" Diana brushed away the tears streaming down her face. "Do you realize you're the first person I've ever told about what I see when I look at people? All my life I've seen this, and it scares me." He turned her around so she was facing him, gently rubbing one of the tears from her eyes with his thumb. "Thank you for telling me." Percy had no idea why he would believe such a ludicrous story, but suddenly he did. He believed she could tell when people were meant to be together. He leaned down and brushed a kiss across her forehead. No one should have to experience something like that alone. She sniffled delicately and accepted the handkerchief he gave her to wipe her nose and eyes. "Our aura was the purest purple I've ever seen," she said, unsure whether or not he'd believe her. He stared at her for a moment, wondering if that was good or bad. He was attracted to her in a way that he'd never been attracted to another woman, but had she put her spell on him? "Did you do something to make me fall in love with you?" She shook her head, her eyes never leaving his. "I couldn't do that to you. I don't want to trick someone into falling in love with me, even if he's the man I should spend the rest of my life with. I want to only be with a man who wants to be with me of his own accord." He nodded for a moment, before leaning down and brushing his lips against hers. "My mother desperately wants me to marry you. I understand your father feels the same?" She nodded. He shrugged. "Let's see how this weekend goes then. We'll spend as much time as we can together, and we'll make a decision before you go back to London." His thumb traced her lip. "I think you would be the perfect wife for me, once you know everything." "What do I not know?" She looked up at him in surprise. He squeezed her shoulders. "It's time for us to go back inside, or we're going to end up forced into a marriage whether we want it or not." He led her into the house and closed the door gently behind him. The dancing was about to start, and although he hadn't danced in over 10 years, he knew he remembered how. Holding her for a waltz was at the top of his list of things he wanted to do. Chapter 3. The following day, Lady Stenwick divided her guests into teams for a scavenger hunt. Each team consisted of a male and a female partner, with each of her children matched up with the person she wanted them to marry. Percy looked over at Diana with a smile when the teams were announced. No one knew Stenwick Manor quite as well as he did. If Diana proved to be at all competitive, the two of them should win easily. If she didn't prove to be competitive, well, he would have hours alone in her company. As soon as they received their first clue, Diana and Percy headed out the back door. "What's the clue?" he asked. Diana looked down and read aloud. "Find a place where you won't have to say nay. You will find your next clue under something to keep warm." She looked at him with a frown. "Not a very original clue, I'm afraid." Percy shook his head. "Mother isn't known for her wit." "The stable? The horses say nay for us?" "That would be my guess." He offered her his arm, and the two set out for the stable. Neither felt the need to rush, so they enjoyed the scenery around them as they walked, taking in the sunshine and the fresh air. It was a beautiful spring day. The flowers were in bloom, and Diana was enjoying getting to know the estate. "Have you lived here all your life?" she asked. He nodded. "We have a townhouse in London that I frequented during the season until I went off to Eton. I left Oxford as soon as my father died and came back here. My mother and sisters still spend most of their time in London, but I prefer the country life. I've lived in London my whole life, but it's always a dream to be in the country. I never feel as if I fit in at the parties." She sighed, kicking at a stone on the path they were walking. It's gotten to the point when I walk into a ballroom, I'm ostracized. People think I'm some sort of a witch, and I hate it. She knew it was partially her own fault for trying to help others, but she couldn't just sit back and let people make doomed marriages. Percy looked at her with surprise. I didn't realize it was that bad for you. Diana nodded. The men avoid me because they're afraid they'll fall under my spell. The women avoid me because so many of their men have been taken by me. My whole purpose is to keep the wrong people from marrying and being miserable, but I've obviously gone about it all wrong. I wish you could have stopped the wedding between Anthony and Gabriella. As beautiful as she is, she makes his life a living hell. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen. He'd known Gabriella slightly before his friend had married her, and he'd seen her toy with the affections of man after man. She'd wanted to marry a duke, though, and she'd done it. She sighed. One of the limitations of my abilities is that I can see when people are wrong for each other, but I can't see why. For instance, I knew that Gabriella and Anthony didn't belong together, but I didn't know why until I saw Gabriella with Sir George Pendleton. Those two belonged together. Their purple was almost as deep as ours. She didn't add that she knew who Anthony should have married as well. He thought about that for a moment. So it's not that either of them are bad people. They just make each other miserable. They could both be very happy with other people. That's right. Think of it this way. I could never be happy married to a person who was selfish and thought only of his own needs. That would make me crazy. But there are some women who are such nurturers, they want someone they can shower their love on. They would be miserable with a man who was a giver, because they couldn't shower him with love. Does that make sense? Percy nodded. I never really thought about it that way. I guess I always thought that two good people would be a perfect match, but not necessarily. He was learning a great deal from her as they talked about how to make a good match. Who'd have thought it possible? I'm always surprised at who does make good matches. I've tried to help young ladies at balls by suggesting they set their cap for the gentleman who has a purple aura with them, but they always seem to want the reds. I guess it's human nature to want what's bad for you. Like a woman on a slimming regimen who wants nothing but sweets. She shrugged as if she'd never understand the people around her. He laughed. I would never compare a woman on a slimming regimen to a woman who is looking for her soulmate, but I can see what you mean. He stopped talking as they stepped into the stable. He walked to his favorite stallion and lifted the blanket hanging on his stall door. Sure enough, there were several envelopes under it, so he took the one with his name written with Diana's. It seemed odd to him to see their names written together that way, but at the same time, it felt so right. Let's see if she does better on this one. He scanned it and shook his head. If you go to an octagonal building and look up, you will find your next clue. Lead the way to the gazebo, my lord. Diana did her best not to laugh at the clue. Mother needs serious help if she ever does this again. Her clues, well, they leave a lot to be desired. He shook his head, hoping that he'd never be involved in a scavenger hunt again. He was enjoying this one, of course, but only because Diana was beside him. Diana smiled. At least she's trying? They hadn't seen any of the other couples while they were out. Do you think anyone else is even trying to win this? He asked, scanning the grounds for the others. She shrugged. This is a getting to know you exercise. Hopefully people are getting to know each other. She didn't particularly care if they won or not. Getting to know him was the only thing she was even considering at that moment. Not too well, I hope. My sisters are half of those other couples. He frowned as they walked. Do you know if the men with them are good for them? She looked at him in surprise. Do you know I wasn't paying attention to auras at all? Well, except to your mother's. She shrugged, half surprised at herself. She had been so caught up with him that she hadn't done what she considered her duty. He stopped short. My mother's? She shrugged. She and the vicar? I know they're not of the same social class, and should never marry, but, well, they're a good match. He let out a bark of laughter. My mother and the vicar? He couldn't imagine his mother married to a vicar. She was the last person who should marry beneath her with her feelings of superiority. I said I don't think it should happen. He shook his head. No, I think it should. She was never happy with my father. I mean, what woman is truly happy in her marriage? He looked at her for a moment. You truly believe she'd be happy married to the vicar? I don't know. I know that he's a good match for her, but I don't know that she would be happy married to him, because she would lose her social status, and that's obviously very important to her. He put her arm through his again and started toward the gazebo. My mother and the vicar. He smiled down at her as they walked. Who else have you seen that should be together, but isn't? She laughed softly. Well, there was one society matron who was a red with her husband, but a purple with her butler. She didn't mention who, because it was just too naughty, but she enjoyed sharing her little secrets with him. Percy let out another laugh. You know, I don't think I've laughed as much as I have with you in the whole time since my father died. Do you miss him? Diana couldn't imagine life without her parents. They drove her mad at times, but she cared about them both a great deal. Percy shook his head. He was a very hard man. I miss the responsibilities I didn't have when he was alive, but I don't miss him at all. I'm sorry. Diana felt badly for him. She had a good relationship with both of her parents, despite their constant attempts to marry her off. Are you close to your mother? Not really. She's a lot more focused on my sisters than she ever has been on me. My father didn't care about much except his own interests. Diana was glad she'd never had to live through anything like that. They spotted one of his younger sisters with her companion racing across the lawn toward the stable. Could they have just figured it out? He sighed. Charlotte is not exactly known for her brain. He looked down at her. More importantly, what was their aura? He watched her intently as she looked at the young couple sprinting across the property. It's yellow. It's a very middle-of-the-road color. They wouldn't be good, but they wouldn't be terrible. If I saw them together at a ball, I wouldn't interfere. Oh good. So they could be content together? She nodded. Most people are going to fall into the middle range. They'll be content, but never truly happy. If they fall in the dark blue or purple, true happiness together is possible. When you see Lucy with her companion, let me know if they're compatible. I will. Truly? I wouldn't interfere if Charlotte fell in love with Stephen. If he makes her happy, then she should marry him. She shrugged. Only when people are red do I do anything at all, and then only if they haven't proceeded as far as engagement. But you said he couldn't make her truly happy? She sighed. There's a feeling of euphoria that everyone experiences when they first fall in love. Even people who aren't truly compatible. If she experiences that with him, and seems happy, don't stop them from marriage. Charlotte didn't have much hope of marrying the man who was right for her anyway, because she happened to know the man was already married. But I want my sisters to have the ultimate happiness. Well, then be a mean big brother and pick out their husbands, but don't expect them to forgive you when you're done. She looked away from him out toward the gazebo where they were walking. She knew he wanted what was best for his sisters, but he had to realize he would push them away if he was too controlling. He sighed. I guess we can just do our best to push them toward men they should be with. We? He patted her hand, which was still tucked into the crook of his arm. We. The clues got sillier and sillier as the day wore on. It was obvious the only thing his mother had worried about with the scavenger hunt was that each couple got as much time alone together as possible. She'd apparently started them all at different places so they wouldn't run into one another too much. Percy watched her as they walked, thinking about what it would be like to be married. He would ask her to sign an agreement that all money from her dowry be set aside for their children. He had no desire for her money. He wanted things to continue as they were with him, supporting his mother and sisters fully. He didn't ever want her, or anyone else, to think that he'd married her merely to get out of the debt his father had created with his gambling. She was the only woman he'd ever met that he was willing to ask to share his life, even though the full debt wasn't yet repaid. He knew she wouldn't care. He loved the way the sun shone off her blonde hair and the way her eyes lit up with laughter at his mother's more unfortunate clues. When they reached the last of their clues, they knew it was the last, because it was clearly labeled, "Last Clue." He was annoyed with himself for not taking advantage of the time they had alone together. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her behind a huge tree by the pond on the edge of his family's property. "I've thought about touching you all day, but I wasn't sure how you'd react," he whispered, looking down into Diana's eyes. He desperately hoped she wouldn't argue with him. Diana took a step closer to him, so they were less than a foot apart, and smiled up at him, knowing exactly what she wanted. "Why don't you see?" He pulled her against him, smiling at her gasp as his body was pressed all up against his. "I want to kiss you." Diana nodded slowly, her gaze glued to his lips as he slowly lowered his head to hers. When his lips first danced across hers, she let out a gasp of surprise. Other men had stolen kisses, but this? He would never have to steal a kiss. If kissing felt like this, then she would hunt him down and force him to kiss her every chance she got. Her hand rose to rest at the back of his neck, while her other went to his shoulder and rubbed him through the fine cloth of his jacket. He pressed his lips against hers a bit harder than at first, and she parted her lips, inviting his tongue inside. His kiss startled her with its familiarity. All at once it felt foreign to have someone else's tongue in her mouth, but right that he was touching her this way. How had she lived her entire life without touching this man? His tongue teased the inside of her upper lip, and she let out a low moan of pleasure, sinking deeper into his kiss. This was what it felt like to be held by someone who cared about you then. She hoped he cared, at least. He wasn't after her money like all the other men of the ton, was he? After a moment, he broke off the kiss, resting his forehead against hers as his eyes bored into her blue ones. "We have to stop," he whispered. She nodded, not even certain what he meant, but willing to agree with anything he said at that moment. "We need to get back to the house with all our clues to give to my mother," he said. When she didn't respond, but instead just kept staring into his eyes, he pushed her away by her shoulders. He carefully took her hand and placed it back into the crook of his arm, guiding her back toward the house. Diana said nothing as they walked, her mind on the brief kiss they'd shared. Never in her life had she imagined a kiss could make her feel that way. It was as if she were floating, not walking. As they passed the rocks he'd been working with the previous day, she looked at them, remembering what it had been like to meet him. One day she would tell her children and her grandchildren just how she had felt when she'd met the man of her dreams. When they walked in the back door, her hand was still in his arm, and her mother ran across the room to pull her away from him, hissing softly, "Did he hurt you? You look like something happened." How could she tell her mother that something had happened? The most wonderful man in the world had just kissed her, and it had changed her world. How could it not? Chapter 4. It was the last day of the house party, and Diana had never been happier. The short affair had been 3 days of absolute bliss to her way of thinking. She looked up at a knock on her bedroom door. Her mother wouldn't knock, so who could it be? She went to the door and flung it open, half hoping to see Percy, but the other half of her knew she'd be scandalized if he showed up at her bedroom door. One of the maids stood in front of her. "Miss Smith? The Earl wishes to see you in his study." Diana had never been to his study, but she immediately nodded. "Could you show me the way?" What did he want to talk to her about? Could he be asking her to stay a little longer and get to know him better? The maid had already walked off, walking quickly through the nearly empty halls of the old house. She led Diana down a staircase and opened a door off the hall. Diana stepped into the room and immediately smiled when she saw Percy sitting at his desk. "You wished to see me?" Percy stood up and walked to her, taking her hands in his and kissing her cheek in greeting. "Please, sit down for a moment." He hovered over her for a moment, as if he was nervous about something, before finally taking his place at the desk across from her. "There's something I need to speak to you about." Diana turned to him eagerly, her face lit up with excitement. "Yes?" He seemed so formal, so she knew it couldn't be a marriage proposal. What could he be so nervous about? "Well, do you remember when we first met? I was sorting through a pile of stones?" She nodded, unsure why he was asking her that. "Of course, I do. Well, I told you I enjoy crafting as an avocation. I need you to know that wasn't precisely true." He looked down at the drawing in front of him, the drawing that was still missing something vital, if only he knew what it was. It wasn't? What was he trying to tell her? He finally met her eyes, leaning back in his chair. "My father had a gambling problem. Before his death, he managed to let so many debts pile up. I've been working for the past 11 years to slowly get out of debt. I sell my stoneworks. You have one of the benches I made." Diana's eyes widened. "I love that bench." A smile split her face. "Your works are wonderful." He smiled, tilting his head to the side. "Thank you." She hadn't reacted to his being a craftsman in the way he'd expected. "So it doesn't bother you that I have to work for a living? You would marry a working man?" He held his breath as he waited for her to answer. She laughed softly. "I think most of the titled gentlemen are, well, wastrels. I couldn't imagine being married to a man who didn't work. My father has always worked." He eyed her for a moment. "You really wouldn't mind?" Diana shook her head. "Of course, I come with such a large dowry that you'd never have to work again if you didn't want to." She hoped he would continue to work, though. She hated the idea of him marrying her for her dowry. "I would want the dowry to go into trust for our children. I refuse to use your money to take care of the debt my father incurred." He watched her carefully to see her reaction to his statement. She smiled. "I like that idea. I don't want to be the wife of a man who does nothing." She shrugged. "I wouldn't mind if you used the money to get out of debt, but I do want you to keep working. I like the idea of being married to a man who does something meaningful." He walked around the desk to where she sat and took her hand in his, dropping down to one knee. "With all that taken care of, I just need to ask. Will you, Diana Smith, do me the great honor of becoming my wife and the next Countess of Pendleton?" Diana felt her heart jump into her throat at his words. "I would be thrilled to be your wife." He seemed to breathe a sigh of relief at her answer and stood up, taking her hand and pulling her to her feet. "Are you sure my vocation doesn't bother you?" He had to be certain she wouldn't change her mind in a month and expect him to quit working for her. She shook her head, hoping he'd kiss her again. He'd only really kissed her the one time and she'd enjoyed it. "When will we marry?" she asked. "I have to ask your father for your hand, and then I'm sure the mothers will start planning things. I think 3 weeks? That's how long it takes to read the banns." She smiled, pressing herself against him. 3 weeks sounds just about right." She pressed a kiss to his chin, hoping he'd dip his head and kiss her, but instead, he pushed her away. "I need to talk to your father before I let myself be seduced by you." She pouted. "But I like kissing you. We'll kiss all the time after we're married. Until then, I need to get this fountain built. I've decided to keep it as a gift for my bride." "Fountain?" He nodded, leading her around the table and showing her the drawing he'd made. "It's missing something, though." She looked at it for a moment, thinking. It needs more love. She could see exactly how it needed to be put into it. Just a small flow of her power to the fountain once it was finished. Love? How can I put love into a fountain? He asked, confused. She smiled. I'll tell you what. You make the fountain, and I'll add the love. You'll understand then. There was a knock at the door then, and it burst open. Her father, a large man with a booming voice, stepped into the room. What are you doing in here with my daughter with the door closed? Alexander looked between the two of them as if he was trying to decide which one to scold first. Percy smiled, taking her hand in his. I've asked her to be my wife. I hope that meets with your approval. Alexander looked between his daughter and the man beside her. Only if she said yes. Half the men in London have asked for her hand. He looked at Diana waiting for her reply. Diana blushed and hugged her father. I said, yes, father. Alexander's smile slowly spread across his face. I'll arrange for the dowry to be transferred to you on your wedding day. When will that be? He seemed to be in a hurry to get the deed done to make sure neither of them backed out. Percy shrugged. It takes 3 weeks. I'll talk to my mother and your wife, and I'm certain that between them we'll have a date quickly. Before Diana knew what was happening, her father was bellowing for Lady Pendleton and Jane. When the 2 women arrived, Alex shouted, "They're getting married." Jane looked between Percy and Diana for a moment before running to hug Diana. You're marrying an earl. Diana shook her head. I'm not marrying a title, mother. I'm marrying a man. His name is Percy. Jane ignored the statement and turned to Lady Pendleton. We're going to have to get started planning the wedding immediately. She looked at Percy. When do you want to have the ceremony, my lord? Percy looked over at Diana and smiled. As soon as possible, so 3 weeks? Does that give you enough time to plan everything? The look on his face made it very clear that he didn't care if it gave them enough time to plan everything or not. They were getting married in 3 weeks, and he didn't care who liked it or not. Diana watched as the 2 women started bickering over details like where the wedding would be held and when it would take place. She didn't care about the details at all, caring more about the life she'd lead once she was married to Percy. She walked to the side door and looked back at him, holding her hand out for his. He gazed between the arguing mothers and her father, who was telling the women to keep the price of the wedding down, before joining her and slipping out the door with her to the back gardens. They walked hand in hand toward the gazebo they'd had to go to for the scavenger hunt. Why are none of your designs on display here? Percy looked at her. I don't think you understand just how tight finances have been for my family. My father mortgaged everything that wasn't entailed. I've had to sell everything I've ever created to make enough money to slowly pay down the debts and keep my mother and sisters in dresses for each new season. He sighed. The debts are half gone now, but my work is fetching a larger price with everything I make. If my predictions are correct, I'll be out of debt in about 4 years. He looked at her. Can you live simply for 4 years? Not running off to London for every season? She nodded eagerly. I hate the season. 1 or 2 parties a year, if they're important, I can stand. The rest of them are just the same thing over and over. The same women trying to trap the same men. The same mothers trying to match their daughters to the same men their daughters didn't want last week. I would be happy to never go again. Diana truly hated the season. What about when our daughters are old enough to have seasons of their own? She blushed at the idea of having children with him. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it. I hope to never have to put them through a London season. Maybe we can find them husbands some other way. Don't ask me how, but I don't think any woman should ever have a season forced on her if she doesn't want it. He kissed her cheek, liking how she thought. That sounds good to me. The only time you may be required to go is if my sisters find men they want to marry. I'd want you to see if they were compatible with their beaux." Diana sighed. "No more matching people the old-fashioned way, I guess? We'll only do things the way you want to do them, which means I get to match up the entire world." She'd play along with him and tell him who would be good matches. She just didn't want to have to be the one to tell people who they must marry. Percy smiled. "That sounds good to me. The whole world would be so much happier if everyone only married people who were meant for them, and never married people they didn't belong with." She laughed softly. "That may be true, but I think you'll find people aren't going to agree to marry who I think they should." She looked around her, seeing everything through different eyes as she held his hand and walked with him. "I've really tried to talk to people about their choices in spouses. I've talked until my face turned blue, but to no avail. No one cared what a young girl had to say about who they were compatible with." He looked down at her with a smile. "It is rather hard to believe that you can look at a couple and see whether or not they should marry." "I know it is. I'm glad you believe me though." She didn't think she could marry him if he hadn't known or understood what a burden it was to her. "I didn't at first. It's when you mentioned the Lancasters that I knew. He's told me how miserable he is being married to her. They fight constantly. They do a really good job of hiding it." She shrugged. "Why did he tell you?" "We were roommates at Eton, and then again at Oxford when he was engaged to her. He had stars in his eyes every time he mentioned her name. I was his best man. His father wanted the marriage, because she was an heiress, and at first he agreed, but long before they were married, he had come to dislike her." "I didn't know that." Percy nodded. "He is the only one who knows that I'm working to support my family. We share a lot with each other. I wish there were a way to match him with the woman he needs." She sighed. She didn't tell him that his sister, Charlotte, was the woman for his friend. She had seen them talking together at a ball and had wanted to cry. The pure purple had been beautiful, but he was a married man. He won't divorce her. He stepped into the gazebo and took a spot on one of the benches, patted the seat beside him. She sat with him automatically, still holding his hand. No one had held her hand that way since she was a small child, and she found it comforting. "Is it hard for you to know that people don't belong together when they have no choice in the matter?" "Sometimes. I want to rage at people not to marry the wrong person, but no one is going to believe me. I think that's the hardest part for me. I want to help people, but no one will believe a young woman who hasn't even found love herself." He raised an eyebrow as he looked down at her. "Maybe it will get easier once we're married." She smiled up at him, her tongue creeping out to moisten her lower lip. "I hope so." He watched her tongue, and slowly lowered his head, his own barely reaching out to touch the moisture on her lip. He let out a low groan. "I don't want to wait 3 weeks." Diana smiled, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "I want to get married yesterday. How upset would your mother be if I obtained a special license and we got married in 3 days instead of 3 weeks?" She shook her head sadly. "She would be mortified. Mother would assume everyone would think we'd anticipated our vows, and that I was carrying, and we had to get married immediately to spare my shame." Percy sighed, kissing her forehead. "So would my mother. You game?" He didn't really care if people talked about him. They'd been talking about him since his father died. "No, I'm sorry. It's too important to my mother to do everything correctly." "I was afraid you'd say that." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I guess I'll just have to stay here and play with my fountain while you go back to London and make the rounds and act all happy to be engaged." Diana looked up at him with a smile. "I am happy to be engaged. If it were any other man, I wouldn't be, but it's you." He smiled, brushing one last quick kiss across her cheeks. "I hope the next 3 weeks move very quickly for us both then." Diana sighed. You know you'll need to come into town at least once during our engagement. My mother will want to throw a huge engagement ball for us." He groaned audibly. "I'll have to pretend to be one of them again?" She giggled. "I'm sorry. It's expected. We have to do what's expected from Mother at least until we marry. After we're married, we can do whatever we want to do. As long as we hide in the country to do it. I'm going to hold you to that." She pulled his head down for one more kiss before standing. "Please do."